Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Darren Britton and I am the National Assistive Technology Project Officer with the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training. That is ADCET for short. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white middle-aged man with short hair and a beard that's becoming more white than strawberry blonde as the years pass. I'm wearing blue checkered shirt and have blue framed glasses. This webinar is being live captioned by Melissa from Bradley Reporting, and it is also being recorded. The recording of this webinar will be made available on the ADCET website in the coming days. To activate the live captions, you can click or select the CC button in the Zoom toolbar that's located either at the top or at the bottom of your screen. We also have captions available via a browser, and a link to those will now be added into the chat for those that wish to use those. I am joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Victoria, along with colleagues on Lutruwita, that is Tasmanian Aboriginal land. In the spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges both the Lutruwita and Kulin nations and recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of these lands, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I also acknowledge all countries and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people participating in this webinar today and acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their legacy to us. If you would like to share where you're joining from in the chat, that would be most welcome. Okay, today's webinar. Serving as a reminder you are not alone, building community and supporting neurodivergent students through study skill workshops at the University of Adelaide will be presented by Tiana Blazevic. It will explore the recent Neurodivergent Study Skills Workshops offered at Adelaide University and how these tackle feelings of isolation in neurodivergent students. A very topical thing, and as for the numbers have shown and the number of registrations, there's a lot of people very interested in what you have to say today, Tiana. This presentation will run for about 45 to 50 minutes or so, and then at the end there'll be 10 minutes or so for questions. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box to chat with us and with each other, but please remember to choose all panelists and attendees so that everybody can read what you have to say. Tiana's happy to answer questions at the end, and if you have a specific question that you would like asked, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box so that we can locate all the questions in one place. With that being said, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Tiana. I'll throw over to you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to present to you some of my findings and talk to you a little bit today about some of the work that I've been doing at the University of Adelaide. So let's get started. First, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. I also pay my respects to elders past, present, future, and extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people. So a little bit about me as your speaker. I just want to kind of state by firstly starting to say that I would consider myself a specialist in this area of neurodivergency, as I am neurodivergent myself, and I have quite a lot of lived experience, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. But my background is not in psychology or psychiatry or any sort of related health practitioner degrees. I have been, though, working directly with neurodivergent students since 2020 as an academic learning advisor. So the learning advisors at the University of Adelaide are casual, and I've been doing that since 2020. I've been teaching since 2019 across two institutions, the University of Adelaide and Macquarie University, where I'm currently completing my PhD very slowly. I did my master's at the University of Adelaide in research. I also briefly worked at Kaplan Business School for 9 months in the Academic Success Centre, where I developed workshops there as well and worked very closely with international students and supporting international students with disabilities, until I accepted the role of Disability Support Project Officer at the University of Adelaide, where I coordinate the Neurodiversity Project in the Student Life division. My research area is in philosophy, medieval medicine, and epilepsy. My field of philosophy that I look at specifically and that I examined in both my master's and I am examining in my PhD thesis is epistemic knowledge, which, as I say to many people that ask what the hell is that, I say it's a fancy way to say knowledge building and how it intersects with belief systems. I served on 2 governance boards, so the Council of Australian Postgraduates Association and the Association for Academic Languages and Learning, or what's often referred to as AALL. I'm currently a co-lead for developing the Higher Education Neurodiversity Global Network, which I ask everyone looks out for once we've developed it. I am assisting the University of Melbourne's Neurodiversity Project team with this, and I currently sit on a specialist interest group for neurodivergence with other neurodivergent academics as part of the association. I'm dyslexic. I was diagnosed at 16. I had a late diagnosis of ADHD. I'm hoping to receive an autism diagnosis. I'm slowly going through that process. I am also a childhood cancer survivor. I had a rare blood disorder when I was 18 that resulted in the removal of my spleen, making me immunocompromised. So, safe to say that I have had many challenges health wise in my life, and I've had to navigate a world with hidden disability and hidden illnesses. And yes, I do plan on writing a book about it once I have finished my PhD thesis, whenever that will be. So, a little bit about the Neurodiversity Project at the University of Adelaide. So, this project has been running since my employment in March of this year. And the purposes of this project is a few different things. So, it has a few different core aims. Firstly, to create a peer mentoring program for undergraduate neurodivergent students, and this will pilot in 2025. We've currently recruited 30 volunteer mentors for this pilot for next year. It's also hoping to establish a neurodivergent hub, sort of a web page that directs neurodiverse students to university support services in one convenient place, to create additional resources for both staff and students related to neurodivergent learning, which some of these workshops are now a part of, and also to develop and run workshops for neurodivergent students to assist them with their study skills and transition into university. Raise further awareness of neurodiversity and hidden disabilities on campus through events and collaborations. I've done quite a few collaborations now with some of our staff at the University of Adelaide, which includes our student health and wellbeing team and also our HR department on the needs of neurodivergent staff members. And part of this project is also to really connect with students on their experience as neurodivergent learners through student survey, collecting feedback, collecting data, and then incorporating that continuously and synchronously into the project as it develops and moves forward. So before I started the workshops and sort of started wanting to see how these workshops should be developed, I have a bit of a passion interest for data and data collection. I find it really fascinating. And I really wanted to get a deeper understanding of what the registrations were looking like in the Disability Support Unit at the University of Adelaide. And this was because I thought it was really integral and critical to make sure that I'm giving the right advice and looking at our student cohort and seeing where our students are coming from as well. So what I found after looking at about 3 years of data that was given over to me was that the ADHD registrations for each year in the Disability Support Unit was increasing by about 34% on average for every year since 2020. As we know, in 2020, there was a huge spike across the centre for disability conditions being registered with every university. I think many of those were obviously mental health because of the pandemic. And then I also noticed that we had an ASD registration every single year of an average of about 22% every year since 2020. And the reason I wanted to do this data was, as I said, to really make sure that I was getting a very clear snapshot and picture of the students that were coming through our unit. And this was through, the data was collected through the system that we manage and assist our students with called Penelope. However, I also found that our web form data, so our web form registration where students have their first point of contact with our unit, was also really telling. So this gave me a really clear idea of the types of students that were coming through and requiring additional support and the types of challenges that they were facing. So on the screen here, you can see the monthly web form registrations from April to September. So these are just students that are coming through with an official diagnosis. So they've received their medical verification documents and now meeting with our disability advisors, and this is their first point of contact. So on the screen here, you can see that we've got 15 registrations in April, 11 in May, 14 in June, 21 in July, 18 in August, and then 19 in September, and more have increased in the October web form data that I checked this morning. So these registrations were just for ADHD. This is quite a high number because in comparison, our registrations for mental health, so such as depression and anxiety, and those conditions is relatively around the same. Usually ADHD and mental health for our unit kind of goes quite close to one another, and the numbers keep rising every single month. In terms of ASD, so the students that are coming through with just a primary diagnosis of ASD, we have the same web form here, web form illustration that shows all of the registrations. So in April, we only had 2 registrations. In May, only 1. June, we had 3 registrations of ASD. July, we had 3. August was a spike with 6, and 3 again in September. So not as many as ADHD. That's clearly a primary condition that's coming through to us, but ASD is still on the radar here and still technically increasing in 2024. Same with specific learning disabilities. Dyslexia is the prominent one at the University of Adelaide, but we classify things like dyslexia and dyscalculia as specific learning disability in our data sets. And here our registrations are 7 in April, down to 3 in May, 3 in June, 4 in July, 2 in August, and 3 in September. So clearly here we can see that ADHD is the primary that students are coming with, at least at our university. So it'll be interesting to see what other universities are also experiencing. And I know that the ACES division also released their data as well. But our co-conditions tell a very different story. So in the web form data is where our students would alert to us any co-occurring conditions that they are having challenges with. Of course, we only are tracking primary when we're looking at our data in this unit and data as part of the project, but co-conditions tell a really different story of what the students are actually facing in some of their challenges. So on the screen here, we have a visual representation created by AI. It's called Napkin AI. It's a great website that I recommend for students to use, and I use it myself quite often. And here in the middle, we have the additional disabilities, and then we have branches that go into mental health conditions that were listed by students. So this was just for August. In August, we had about, I believe, close to 60 registrations. And out of those registrations, we had 19 students who registered a co-condition. So that's quite a large and significant number. And out of those registrations, they cited things such as having major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, ADHD, insomnia, complex PTSD. So this is all under the mental health conditions branch here on the visual on the screen. We have sensory impairments as another branch here, hard of hearing, auditory processing disorder. We then have neurological conditions as a branch here on the visual, and students stated that they had conditions such as high functioning autism, ASD, epilepsy, and ADHD, autism and ADHD undiagnosed. And then we have another branch, which is our chronic conditions. So chronic fatigue, chronic pain, medical conditions, or in the process of an RA diagnosis. And in our web form, obviously, we're not asking students for any medical verification of these co-conditions. And what I notice when looking at just the mental health registrations is that often about anywhere between 15 to 20% of those students who are coming with a mental health condition and wanting support in those areas were listing ADHD or ASD as one of their co-conditions. So whilst tracking the data can be a really good way for universities and for disability support or access equity inclusion units to get a better understanding of their students, I think when we really dig into it, those co-conditions tell a very different story and give a more holistic view of what some of the challenges are for our neurodivergent students and for our other students who have different conditions. So now I want to give you a little bit of reasoning as to why I decided to do workshops. So what was the reason for these workshops? Well, as soon as I began my role in coordinating this project and reflecting over my time as a learning advisor, because I'm still working as a learning advisor in a casual capacity, I really have often noted the gap for our undiagnosed students and students who are awaiting a diagnosis or a self-diagnose. We know that there are quite a lot of barriers to ADHD diagnoses in particular, same with ASD. My diagnosis was a 16-week process, which I would say is quite expedited. It still required a lot of executive functioning on my behalf, a lot of booking appointments, a lot of following up, and it cost me upwards of $1,800 for both my diagnoses as well as going back and forth with the GP to have medical clearance for my medication. So, while the core of the project is to create a peer mentoring program, these workshops are really critical, I think, for student retention and experience beyond just peer mentoring, and a focus on the second largest concern for students, which is their academic skills. So, this was recently highlighted in the University Accords, is that one of the largest stressors for students was the financial barriers or financial worries, but then we had academic concerns. And I knew this as a learning advisor, I'd seen it for 5 years. So these workshops grew from both a need to not only bridge this gap for the disability support unit and provide additional support for students that goes beyond that peer mentoring. Whilst peer mentoring is great, I think a focus on academic skills and strategies is really needed for this cohort, but also a deeply personal reason. As I've stated, I'm neurodivergent myself, and I spent a lot of my time in both my postgraduate degrees and my undergraduate degree feeling quite alone and isolated, feeling like I didn't really know what I was doing and trying all these different strategies. And because I was quite a high achieving student, I had to work very hard, and I did get really, good grades, and I was high achieving. A lot of people didn't see all of the struggles that were going on behind that, how stressed I was, or how much I had to try all these different strategies, or the issues I was having with my executive functioning whilst not understanding or not knowing that I had ADHD, but just knowing that I had dyslexia. So, when thinking about what sort of academic skills should we focus on, these were some of the themes that were created based on my experience and knowledge of these students in this cohort, but also thinking about what are the critical things that we need for neurodivergent students to help them and assist them in these workshops. So the first session was on our introduction to neurodiversity and self-advocacy. Time management organization was our second session, creating a conducive study environment that focused a lot on sensory needs. Different note-taking strategies, because there are a plethora of note-taking strategies that students don't realize are out there. Reading and comprehension skills. We talked a lot here about visual tracking for ASD students. Understanding and managing executive functioning, that was really important, and also completely at capacity for this area. So a lot of students booked this particular session. Memory techniques and retention, because we know that students who are neurodivergent have issues with working memory and short-term memory. Writing skills and overcoming writer's block. So this focused a lot on what I like to call neurodivergent paralysis. I don't like the word procrastination when we talk about neurodivergent students. I prefer the term paralysis because it is linked to executive functioning. Research skills, so how to avoid the research rabbit hole. That was the focus of this session. A lot of there might be some assumptions that students who are neurodivergent, specifically students who have ASD or ADHD, are not wanting to do their research and not wanting to do their work. But I've actually found over the last 5 years, and thinking about myself too, it's getting them to stop going down the rabbit hole. That's actually the hardest part of their study experience, because they become super interested and super passionate, which makes them amazing researchers. But it's also, again, really, really hard. Then we looked at drafting. So we talked a lot about grammar here and how to use AI to help you with your drafting process, presentation skills and public speaking, and then stress management and self-care, because we're going into the exam period in the semester. So the ones that had the most registrations were introduction to neurodiversity and self-advocacy, time management, that hit capacity, so we couldn't fit any more students in the registration. creating a conducive study environment, note-taking, reading and comprehension, understanding, managing executive functioning, and memory techniques. So all of these sessions hit their capacity for registrations. There was about 35 registrations per session. So creating the workshops. Each workshop, the way that it was designed, the way I designed it, built on one another. So that's beginning with our key foundations. So understanding, well, what does it mean to be neurodivergent? What does it mean to advocate for ourselves in these spaces? Thinking about our sensory needs, the discovery of those needs through self-reflection worksheets that I created on Canva for each session. And I'll talk about those briefly. I used quite a lot of research-based evidence. So most of my time over the last 12 weeks was spent reading lots of different journal articles, lots of different new research that's out there, and there is so much, which is fantastic to see. But also I consulted a lot of readings on, general readings, things like Dr. Devon Price's Unmasking Autism and lots of other books that are now out and available for the general audience, because I found that the academic stuff focused more on the, why is this happening, or why do neurodivergent students do this? But these general readings are more focused on the how do we overcome this challenge? How do we manage this? So that is where some of the workshops were focused on, was quite a lot of generalized reading and also many hours scrolling on TikTok. I know that that's a bit controversial, but TikTok has a plethora of different voices and community. And as we know, the neurodiversity community did come out of the online community, specifically the autistic community. So I think it's a really important source to look at and to explore. I have an entire folder that is just labeled Spicy Brain, and there are 250 videos saved in it right now, and I'm sure a lot of us have that too. So each workshop contained a variety of worksheets, activities, self-reflection was the core activity, and optional group tasks. Students always had an option to participate individually through their self-reflection worksheets or discuss on their table their self-reflection, and there was absolutely no expectation, and this was communicated consistently, that they needed to talk to each other, so no forced group work. And I mentioned this to them all the time and reaffirmed that. So they had 3 options. It was do your self-reflection individually, sit in silence, put your headphones on if you need, talk with your group, use the reflection sheets as a talking point to collaborate with one another. Or if you still want to participate in the wider group, I had an anonymous Slido that was always present on the screen. So students could upload their thoughts and then I would use that as a talking point and talk about it. So it took the pressure and the anxiety off, but allowed them to still participate in the wider group. So the marketing of the workshops, I think this is something that needs to be addressed and spoken about is, well, how do you market these workshops? How do you start them? Because that's really, really important. A lot of my role is actually doing marketing and outreach, which is great. I am a bit of an extrovert, so I'm comfortable in this area. And I thought if I wanted to get students to know that these workshops were existing, because I did not have that much lead-in time for marketing, I really needed to hit the ground running on this. So some of the variety of channels that I used was quite widespread. So I presented at learning and teaching committees for each of our faculties. We have 3 faculties at the University of Adelaide, and I encouraged the leadership there to advertise the workshops in their lectures, in their courseworks, and on their own announcements. I had a global announcement published on our learning system Canvas. So for 3 days, every single student was able to see these neurodivergent study skill workshops and get the registration details. I contacted our social media department for my division, who posted every single Tuesday at 8:00 a.m. before the workshops to pick up any students who hadn't seen any of these announcements. I used my network that I had built over 10 years of being both a student and a staff member. So I sent a lot of emails and had a lot of meetings with academics that I'd come across, or people that, I'd had conferences with and coffees with, to get them to, put the word out there for me. I had our disability advisors, who are fantastic, also promote these workshops in their consultations with students, and this was really important and great. I also utilised our digital hub screens around campus. So we have quite a lot of different digital media outlets. One of those is these really, really big screens that appear everywhere on our campuses. And so I made sure that that was consistently running on a loop for us as well. In terms of the universal design for the workshops, I really put some thought into making sure that the wayfinding was appropriate, that we're considering UDL in the pre-part of the workshop, not just during and post. So the slides, every time I created them, were always different and incorporated accessible colors in their design, such as pastel colors or contrasting colors. And also there was always some sort of design that had what I'd like to call maybe a bit of sensory stimulation, something that's a bit different. And so the workshop structure itself, the way that the 1.5-hour workshop went for, it was really kept the same. So students were able to know that when they entered the workshop, if they'd come consistently, that they were going to have the same structure, but the slides, the images were always different. And so this, I thought, kept a good balance of routine and interest for the students. Only specific fonts were used that were suitable for neurodivergent students. I know that there is some controversy at the moment around this, but I just wanted to make sure that all of my bases were covered. In the booking form itself, so we were able to use the Calendly. It's a quite a well-known booking system for appointments and workshops. Students were asked to supply me with the type of support that they might have needed either in the workshop itself, whether that's physical access, captions, materials before, materials after, and I would consistently check these workshop bookings every single day during the week. Text reminders were sent out both 24 hours before and 4 hours before, with very specific instructions on how to find the location of the workshops, which was held in our library. I consistently checked in with students at the beginning of every workshop to see if I was missing anything, whether that was through the booking form, the website, or prior to their arrival. So if there were any access routes that were blocked, that or any sort of wayfinding that was becoming an issue for them in the library, because we are going through some renovations at the moment. In terms of the universal design learning in the workshop space itself, so as I said, we were in the library, but something that I recommended to students all the time, whether it was communicating via email to them, but also communicating in the workshops themselves, that there was absolutely no judgment for being late. I didn't care what the reason were. You didn't need to tell me why you're late or apologize or do anything like that. So I affirmed to them in every workshop that I don't mind if you're a couple minutes late. I mean, we are talking about a cohort of people that have time blindness and executive functioning. It's not okay to shame them for being late or draw attention to that. No requirement to participate in the group, hence why we always had the online Slido/self-reflection worksheets as an alternative. Students were encouraged to get up and walk around or stretch at the back of the room if they needed. We know that students with ADHD, people with ADHD specifically, have hypermobility issues. I myself am one of those. And also to make sure that they had stimming toys close to them if they needed. Anything that they needed to stim or get up and walk around was completely fine with me. I provided paper on tables for anyone who wanted to draw or, doodle on their paper to maintain focus. And we also discussed every single workshop how many lights we wanted to keep on in the area that we were in. We were very lucky that we were in a room that we were able to control the lights, but this was something that built a lot of community within and right at the very beginning of the workshop, because I'm also very sensitive to UV lights. I really don't like them, and neither did any of the students. So every single workshop we would decide, all right, how are we feeling today? Let's turn off these lights, and see how we went. And so that was really appreciated by the students. In terms of the workshop attendance, so the workshops were held in person. There was an average of 20 to 30 students for each week, with an average of 21 students so far that have attended every single workshop. We had a few repeat students, but there was always a very mixed cohort in each of these workshops. The workshops were held on a Tuesday only. I only work 4 days a week from 10 o'clock to 11:30 a.m. The content was uploaded weekly to the disability support webpage, along with further reading, as well as all of the workshop materials. And this content's only available for the University of Adelaide students. Holding the workshops in person was, I think, really important because it created a sense of community, but we did receive quite a lot of feedback about students who wanted these workshops online or wanted them recorded as well. So next year, once the funding is secured, we are going to be exploring online and face-to-face options just to see if we can try and make sure that this is as equitable as possible for all the students. Students were asked to fill out a survey after each session. They've reported in these survey results, and I will show you them shortly, that they've really enjoyed this community atmosphere and being around other neurodivergent learners. And the surveys also, for me, really provided immediate feedback on my teaching and my pedagogy and the content of each workshop. So I was able to adjust when necessary, and it's also given me some really good feedback for next year and what I can be doing and how I can improve. When I was tutoring for the University of Adelaide, the CELTs were really great, but I always felt like they came way too late because I want to adjust my teaching now. If I'm not doing the right thing, or if there is something that I could do better, I want to know now. So this is something that I've been doing for a long time, and I've found that it's really helpful. And I would bribe sometimes the students with buttons, with bookmarks, with sunflower things, just so I could get them to fill out these surveys, because I know that they get hounded all the time for surveys, but I communicated to them that it's really important that I get this data. So, as I've said, students shared that they did not feel isolated, and that was really, really important to me. So the approach of the workshops, so how I made sure that I was doing this to the best of my abilities, but also thinking about this cohort of students and what they interact with and hear every day. So the workshops were scaffolded in a way that students first discuss common assumptions about neurodivergent students. And this is where my philosophy background comes in. And we would often discuss how neurodivergent learners are always, or most of the time, sort of boxed in to neurotypical study routines or ideas about what is best academic practice. What I've seen and learnt as a learning advisor is that students are not really asked to reflect on their academic practices or reflect on what it means to be a student. And so I drew quite heavily on my own experiences as both a student and staff and being neurodivergent. And we often did talk about these stereotypes and assumptions. For example, I am dyslexic, yet I have published 2 book chapters. I've gone through postgraduate degrees. I talk a lot. I run training sessions, but I'm a dyslexic academic. And so that in of itself is an assumption that people make about me when I say I have dyslexia. And I've spent a lot of my time advocating for myself to have the academic community recognize that there are many of us. There are many dyslexic academics, and we are quite amazing at our jobs. We just sometimes need a little bit of help in certain areas. And I also really reflected on some of my quirks that I didn't realize were neurodivergent quirks growing up too. So talking about my family, my relationships, and, talking about those things as well in that neurodivergent space. And whilst this vulnerability can be really hard, and you're always teetering that line of, professional and also personable, I thought it was really necessary for me to open up first in order to give students the courage to start talking about it with each other, or to start talking about it as a group. And because these workshops were available to all neurodivergent students regardless of their program status, so whether or not they were a PhD or a first year undergraduate student, I found it really helpful that HDR students were often coming to these workshops because they had a little bit more confidence to speak about these things. And in a sense, they kind of started already providing that peer mentoring to other undergraduate students or postgraduate coursework students. So as I said, the workshops often examine how learning should also always be first situated within its cultural context and its social context, same with neurological conditions or disabilities. and that we really need to look at the social constructs and ideas around that rather than thinking about things in a deficit or biomedical deficit model. We often did talk about how the biomedical model helps to explain our symptoms, it helps to explain neurodivergence, but that social and cultural model is really important. So, for example, to give you one, instead of discussing how to prioritize something in our session on time management, we discussed what I like to call peak productivity. So, this is the hours of the day that you work best and for how long. We talked about how it is not reasonable, nor is it normal for any person to work for 8 hours straight, and that the studies show that realistically you're only working for 3 hours, maybe 4 hours at a max. And we talked about, okay, well, what's the time of day that really works well for me? How do I work with fatigue levels as well and an interest-based nervous system? What does that look like for me for my peak productivity? And who defines what it means to be productive in this society and in our own cultures as well? What is productivity? So every workshop, along with these socio-cultural examinations and discussions and ideas, also provided students with tools and examples that they could use in their practice to help them. So virtual study tools, immersive YouTube writing sessions, 8D audio, which is experimental, Goblin tools, which I highly recommend everyone to look at for neurodivergent students or being neurodivergent yourself. It saved me many a time. Zotero, Obsidian. So I showed them how to use Zotero and Obsidian together to assist with their learning and to assist with executive functioning. And also there was quite a heavy focus on artificial intelligence. So using systems such as Notebook LM, MindGrasp, as well as Audemic. So a lot of these AI websites are now being used by students who are neurodivergent to help them with the workload and the cognitive overload as well. So, as I said, whilst most of the workshops do contain some sort of tool for students to implement, I really emphasize to them that these tools that I give you, it's not an authoritative use these tools. These will definitely help. Use it and discover whether or not it works for you. And if it doesn't, push it to the side. So I call this the discovery process. And I found that over my years in working closely with neurodivergent students and also reflecting on my own experience, that we feel this sense of shame and isolation, and we're often more prone to burnout because we're trying to make things work that just don't work. We're trying to fit into these systems that don't work for a neurodivergent learner. So how do we question this, and how do we break out of those systems and find something that works for us? And so when we're discussing all of these topics in the workshops, a lot of students revealed quite a lot of learning trauma in high school and primary school, and how many of their ideas of what makes a good student or how I need to study are coming from their high school experiences, especially. And that is then causing them to perhaps not have the best experience at university because they're doing things that don't work for their neurodivergent brain because they don't know anything else. And our discussions, revolved around that quite a lot, where we then also talked about, okay, so if you're being told to prioritize, that's not going to work for you. Let's talk about that peak productivity instead. Let's talk about how to get rid of burnout or how to avoid burnout. And let's talk about having a potato day, which is normalizing, relaxing your body so that you can have a better study day tomorrow and not feeling like you have to be working all the time, because it will lead to burnout. So I really wanted to stress to the students about my discovery process, or again, I call it the discovery process, is that these workshops, each of them, are about discovering what works for you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. You can pick and choose the strategies that you want and let me know if it's working for you. And if you've tried any of these strategies and you want to talk about it with other students, you can do so in your self-reflection activities, and you can also talk to each other. And so those reflection worksheet activities that I made them complete, often there was about 3 or 4 reflection worksheets per workshop in most cases. These were kept as a journal. So I said to the students, try and keep these in a safe place where you can, because these are going to help you reflect on what's working for you in your past, your present, and potentially in your future. Because I found that I have lots of different strategies that I've tried. It's worked for 6 months, and then for whatever reason, my brain is like, nope, it's not working now. And I forget what strategy I did. But if I started writing it down, I knew that I have somewhere to reflect back on what has worked for me in the past, and I can go back to that. I think it's also really important when creating supports for neurodivergent students that we really need to approach them holistically. And this is because when I would have students come to me, and I learnt this over the years, it was hard to break out of that immediate response, that academic response. They would come to me and say, I want to learn how to be a better student. I need to be a better student because I want to do better in this course and I'm really trying. They say, how do I study better? How do I plan my time better? And my first question before I had experience and went through my own self-reflection was, okay, so we need to prioritize and we need to do this, this, and this. But realistically, I should have been asking, and I asked that now, what are you sleeping? How many hours are you sleeping? What's your sleep patterns like? What's the well-being like? What's the nutrition like? Because all of that does impact your study and it impacts your life and it impacts your experience too. So recent research is really highlighting the co-occurring conditions in the neurodivergent population. We know that women with ADHD, those who menstruate with ADHD, are more likely to have PCOS. I have PCOS. PMDD, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, insomnia, circadian rhythm issues, restless leg syndrome, fatigue, and a whole bunch of sleep issues. I have insomnia and had insomnia for many years and an immune disorder. And this is all stuff that's now coming into the literature and being researched as well. And so we have to start thinking about this. In terms of the reflection activity, why reflection as an activity and did it work? Yes, it did work, and I was very surprised that students were happy to fill out these reflection activities. I really thought this was going to flop, but it didn't, and it was great. So reflection worksheets, I think, are a really good synchronous activity. It allows collaboration, learning, self-acceptance. It allows community building because you can talk about each other's strategies. And it also allows neurodivergent students that autonomy and agency over their own academic practices. Because as I've said to many academics, neurodivergent students know what works for them. Many of them know that they're spending a lot of time. They already do a lot of internal monologuing and a lot of internal reflection. So this is just giving them that physical outlet to put it down on the paper. And the reflection also allowed them to ask, again, what each other's strategies are. So when they became more comfortable with each other, and because I did have more experienced HDR students here in the workshops, it really provided that collaborative community building exercise. And so these worksheets, again, as I've said, are really critical because it helps students to reflect on the past and what's worked for them, what will work for them, instead of focusing on what they can't do. And I think with reflection, the reason that some students might struggle with it is because often I think we're asking them the wrong questions. It's fine, I think, to ask a student in a reflection worksheet, okay, what's leadership? What's good leadership? What's good communication style? But rarely have I ever seen any courses where lecturers or course coordinators are asking students to think about, how do you take notes? Why do you take notes? What stands out to you? How do you memorize things? That's not being reflected on. That's the role of a learning advisor, is to help students reflect on that. But I think it should be incorporated into curriculum. And so critical reflection worksheets are strength-based approaches that allow the student to discover more about what works for them rather than telling them what to do. And so the satisfaction so far, now I have collected the data for session 12 and it stayed exactly the same, but the workshop satisfaction session, we had a total of 108 responses from students, and we had a 72% extremely satisfied response. 24% said that they were somewhat satisfied, and 4% said that they were satisfied. There was no indication that students held a neutral position or a negative experience of any of these workshops. And here's some of the feedback from students that they've liked about the workshop specifically. So one student said normalizing memory issues rather rather than a personal failure, and focus on stimming and also the different types of neurodivergence that impact different types of memory. I was really glad this covered the aspects of executive functioning paralysis that I struggle with most. The post worksheets were talking to be able to identify things that work for me specifically. I really enjoyed the short demonstration on the Obsidian and Zotero, giving me a little hope that I can lift myself out of the misery in regard to the semester-wide project I'm currently undertaking. I love to listen to the presentation, the short reflections that I've not done before, especially through note-taking, and the visual reminder reflection and daily schedule sheet to see where my peak productivity is. So for terms of building community, students said that they liked getting to be around neurodiverse people and having it run by someone who is neurodiverse and has lived experience. It felt really inclusive and relaxed. They liked talking in a group about strategies that really helped with figuring things out and understanding new strategies, and the inspiration for the title of this talk serving as a reminder that you are not alone. Negative outcomes are expected and a plethora of strategies to try. Some of the shorter feedback was knowledge sharing, open and supportive atmosphere, shared community, supportive environment, and engaging activities. And one email that I received, which hit home to me, was a student, an international student, who was very grateful to not be pressured to interact with the classmates. And he stated that it was really helpful to him and really understanding, and thanked me quite profusely. So this was quite a touching moment. And again, this is, I think, a really key thing when you're designing workshops and designing activities, that you should be thinking about different ways that a student with ASD can still participate without being forced to discuss things. So I think another really good thing to highlight here is Slido. It is such a great tool, and it's so simple and so effective. And this is where my research and my background comes in. And I just want to highlight this quote here by James Alcock's book chapter, The Propensity to Believe, where he states that virtually every society is a society of contradiction, valuing and promoting reason and logic to some degree, but at the same time valuing and promoting deeply held transcendental beliefs that defy that logic. In consequence, individuals learn to question, to analyze, to apply logic in one belief system, but not to do so in the other. Essentially, seeing is believing. And that's why the Slidos for me were really important in building that community, because it showed students that they were not the only ones that were struggling with this. So here in one slide, I asked them, what is the first word that comes to mind when you're told to write? And many of them said panic and anxiety and torture, and they're not alone in those emotions. What has been your experiences with reading and interpreting text, both positive and negative? Many of them said frustration, escape, thinking of connection. So they're seeing physically here some of their responses, and they're seeing here that, again, they're not alone in some of these emotions. The last one, again, I've had many Slidos, so I'm just highlighting for a few. But in what ways, if any, do you find that stimming helps your memory? So many of them said moving and focus, withdraw from excess stimuli. So again, I think that seeing is really truly believing. So very lastly, bridging the gap. I think these workshops are really important in bridging the gap for access and equity and inclusion services. So for us, this was really important in my unit, because again, this is for all students. It's not just for students who have a medical diagnosis. In most sessions, there was that even split between students who ticked, yes, I have an access plan, or no, I do not have an access plan. So reasonable adjustments when they registered for the workshops, and there was a total of 157 students who ticked no. Now, again, some of those are repeat students, but in total, we did have 338 registrations for the workshops, and 204 students attended over the 12-week period. Many of the students who ticked no to not having an access plan, no, not being registered with our disability support services, they stated that they were either awaiting a diagnosis, not sure and exploring, self-diagnosed, or did not want to disclose their status to the university. So I think it begs the question of, we can provide students with reasonable adjustments, but what's the next step beyond that? How do we help students who are undiagnosed, that have financial barriers to diagnosis or are just exploring and figuring themselves out? Importantly, how do we help often what I think is a forgotten cohort, which is HDR students? There's not much support for them, especially for academic skills and writing. So how do we provide support for them too? And these workshops, I think, are just one step that universities can take to acknowledge those barriers and provide students with assistance that goes beyond the legal requirements. So my final word, as I said, I often in these workshops have acknowledged the struggles of neurodivergent students. And of course, there are situations where there are inherent requirements or poor infrastructure, but I think just acknowledging that, hey, I see that this is a problem is really critical. Acknowledging this through either my own personal lived experience as a neurodivergent educator and using that research-based evidence. So making sure to incorporate other neurodivergent voices was really important. And I try to highlight this as much as possible. I think in order for us to start supporting neurodivergent students beyond those reasonable requirements and legal requirements, it's really important to think about how the staff are feeling, because how can we reduce stigma and how can we expect students or want students to disclose? Because we do, we want to provide support for them. I come from an amazing disability support unit with amazing staff that really want to support these students, but how can we expect our students to disclose if within the staff community, there's not much support for neurodivergent staff either. So I think that's another thing that universities need to focus on as well, is that, okay, you want us to support neurodivergent students, you need to support the neurodivergent staff at the same time, because they're having the same problems too. And so I find that students really appreciated that disclosure of my own struggles, both past and present. It reminded them that I'm human, I have layers of complexity, and really importantly, I'm not the source of truth on neurodivergence. So I really encourage my students to read the sources, to follow up and to question things too. Again, I'm not the source. I have my own lived experience. I have my own lens, and other people have lots of different experience. I think sometimes when you are in a position of authority, students sometimes forget that, and it's really important to remind them that you're not always the source of truth on things, and that we're human, we'll make mistakes, and we're not always the best at what we do sometimes. So here's just my reference list from today. I encourage you to connect with me via email or LinkedIn if you'd like to ask any questions about the project or the workshops, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Absolutely brilliant. Let me first say thank you, Tiana. Look, there's lots of applause and claps, etc., coming up, and lots of questions, which we'll get to very briefly. Look, there was so much covered in there. This could have easily gone, and each workshop could be broken down, I think. And I think everybody would love that at some point. But look, all of this will be made available onto the ADCET website, and we'll get into a couple of questions. We're not going to get through all of them because there's a lot there. And so people have been upvoting. So we'll go for those ones which have had the most responses for that. And there's one from Deb early on when you were talking about the numbers, and they were curious about the numbers for combined ADHD, AUD, and EDS, and that they've had increased numbers over the years as well.
Yes, so in the registration forms for the workshops, a lot of students indicated ADHD. So they said, yes, I have ADHD, self-diagnosed. And again, many of them would state ADHD or dyslexia, and then would follow up with the, I'm also self-diagnosed with this as well. So I had a lot of students also who, again, were in that discovery process, that were coming to these workshops and didn't put on the registration form that they had any form of neurodivergent conditions because they weren't sure. And so they used the workshops as a way to discuss with some of the other students, the process of diagnoses, how to get diagnosed, where they should be looking, because something that got highlighted quite a lot in the workshops was, if you do have an ADHD diagnosis, you've just gotten your medication, where do you go? In South Australia, GPs can prescribe medication, but only a few of those can. And so there's no list, I can't just Google, where do I, go for a diagnosis? And so many of these students ended up having conversations on their experience of diagnosis and which GPs would, help and provide and were safe to go to, which was really important.
Excellent. Which leads kind of into the next question as well. And that was about when you're talking about the marketing of the students, and that was going out to all students. So, so did students have to disclose, in an inclusive way, etc.? And was it open to all students? There's two questions here. And the fact that that was open to all students to come along to these neurodivergent workshops.
Yes, so they didn't have to disclose. It was not a requirement. Again, if they were just curious, wanting to learn more about themselves. We had a few international students who registered and again stated no disclosure. They didn't disclose anything but still came to the workshops. Again, I think because they're afraid of that disclosure, afraid of it going to, various government places, which we know does not happen in any way, shape or form. And we kept the utmost confidentiality and privacy. But that's what I really liked about the workshops and opening it up to all levels of students, because it helped with building that community, and the HDR students who were confident were then able to give some peer mentoring to some of those students.
Yep, excellent. Which again, all of these are blending into, but was there any data on students who seek and get assessments, during and because of their studies? So there might have been some, certainly you're saying at the workshops that were, oh, how do I go about this? I think there's something, etc. That's there. But wider, you were looking at 3 years of data, was it? Was there anything in that data showing students which had then been diagnosed now that they're at the institution?
No, there wasn't anything in that data set. So in that data, where I looked at the average, that was just what was coming from our system called Penelope. So this is purely the registration students that had come through the disability support unit and registered with the unit. In the survey that I released that ran for about 3 months, this was a university-wide survey that students optional to complete. There was many of them who identified that they were self-diagnosed, but they were not registered with disability support services, and also quite a few of them I had 167 responses to this survey. Many of them indicated that they had an official diagnosis but were not registered with disability support services. And when I've spoken with some of these students in my capacity as a learning advisor, I've come across many of them and I've asked them that question: why, if you've got an official diagnosis, why are you choosing not to register? Many of them just say, I don't feel like I need it right now, or nothing bad has happened as of yet right now. And this is where our unit has really, over the past few years, done a lot of hard work to show that students can get and should be seeking out that support, even if they don't feel like they need it, because one day they might.
No, fantastic. Look, we're not going to get through certainly all of the questions, but I'm sure Tiana is going to, help us answer some of those, and we'll put those up with the slides and information and those references, along with people who are certainly curious about some of the authors that you spoke about today, some of the papers, some of the publications, and so we'll make sure that we get all of that up there. I did just have a generalist question because it's come up. It's touched on with a few questions there as well, and that's around that. How can this be replicated? It takes a lot of work, as you've pointed out, to do that, to be able to pick up and replicate it at other institutions.
Yeah, I think this is, again, a really good question, and it's something that requires funding. It's something that requires universities to look at their funding structures and also to move beyond the legal requirements. So my manager and her predecessor had been trying for several years to get my position funded, so that we could have this project and create the peer mentoring program, which then the workshops came as part of that, as part of my design and want to support students further. And so I think we really need to look at funding structures and also look at how disability support units should have project officers as well. I think if we had project officers as a continuing and permanent position within access, equity and inclusion, the role of a project officer is to go and do internal and external engagement. They'll then have the time to do the surveys, to run the workshops, to create and raise awareness and spread awareness. I'm quite unique. I'm pretty sure I am the only person in Australia who holds a role in both as a learning advisor and as a disability support project officer. But I think that is one step that universities can take, is to start looking at their access, equity, inclusion, and start thinking about how those units at the moment, many of them probably would not have the time to do this. That's why they seek internal and external funding to create these projects and to create these, and it has to become permanent, I think, in order for us to continue supporting neurodivergent students, because those project officers, those people who work in the third spaces, can then go out and do a lot of outreach to the academics as well and help support the disability advisors and the managers who are already having to do quite a lot of work in this area and support students in a myriad of ways.
No, fantastic. Look, again, we could talk for hours, but please, everybody, join me in thanking Tiana for this. And I think we may have you back for some follow-ups on this, definitely. As I said, the recording for this webinar will be made available on the ADCET website in the coming days, and please feel free to share this when you get that with your colleagues, as I'm sure many of you will do. We'll also ask that you complete a short survey on this webinar and sign up to the ADCET newsletter if you'd like. These links are now being added to the chat box for people. Also, please save the date. We've got 2 upcoming webinars. I feel like the university is not made for people like me, and that's about embedding neuro-affirming practices and building a neurodiverse community within the library, and an accessibility in Office 365 inclusive isn't elusive, and the details of those will be put into the chat box. So once again, thank you very much, Tiana, for a fantastic presentation today. Very topical, and we could all do with 100 of you, I think, across Australia as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and go in peace.
Thank you.